The sky above the financial district does not change color with the gentle transitions of dawn instead. It is instantly pierced by the harsh, vertical glare of glass monoliths and the synchronized ignition of millions of artificial lights. Before the first bird can utter a sound into the cool morning air, the concrete corridors below are already humming with a low register, mechanical rumble. We hear the sharp, rhythmic clicking of hard-soled shoes against paving stones, a sound that mimics the ticking of a countdown clock, driving hundreds of thousands of bodies forward with an unvocalized urgency. We smell the sharp, chemical astringency of freshly bleached lobbies, mixed with the stale, oily exhaust fumes rising from underground parking structures. In our hands we clutch cardboard cups of black coffee, using the bitter heat to jolt our nervous systems into a state of artificial vigilance, before we have even had the chance to look at the open horizon. Our eyes are already narrowed, fixed entirely on the small, glowing panes of glass held inches from our faces, watching numbers fluctuate, notification accumulate, and market metrics scroll past in an endless, unblinking torrent. We are physically present on the solid crust of the earth, yet our awareness has already been completely colonized by a digital landscape that demands our immediate, unyielding mobilization. We move together in this dense morning migration, bound by a shared subterranean panic that we rarely dare to articulate to ourselves or to one another. We look at the digital ledgers that record our balances, and we do not see a neutral tool for social exchange. We see an existential report card that dictates our right to draw breath on this planet. We have been deeply conditioned to believe that our security, our safety, and our fundamental value as human beings are entirely dependent on our capacity to accumulate, to protect, and to fortify our material parameters against an unpredictable future. This belief creates a collective hallucination of permanent lack, an internal poverty that has absolutely nothing to do with the actual numbers in our accounts. We can possess a surplus that would sustain a village for generations. Yet the moment we step into the workspace, we feel an icy, instinctual claw tightening around our lower ribs, whispering that we are always just one market correction, one restructuring event, or one unforeseen disaster away from absolute ruin. We have turned our daily labor into a desperate, unending siege, building high walls of financial insurance while our inner lives systematically rot from a total lack of light, circulation, and spontaneous joy. The heavy, invisible cloud of survival anxiety that hangs over our modern cities is not an individual defect or a personal weakness. It is a systemic trauma that we absorb through the very air we breathe. We live in an economic ecosystem that thrives on our perpetual sense of inadequacy. Culture that explicitly teaches us that to be content with what is right here is to invite stagnation and failure. We have signed an unwritten contract that commands us to sacrifice the living reality of the present moment on the altar of an idealized, fully secured future that never actually arrives. We sprint through our days, with our eyes fixed 10 miles down the road, treating our relationships, our creative impulses, and our physical health as secondary variables to be managed or traded for greater efficiency. The atmosphere we inhabit is thick with an anticipatory friction, a permanent state of bracing against a phantom scarcity that forces us to view the world not as a generous cooperative network, but as a hyper-competitive arena where every other human being is a potential threat to our personal preservation. Let us stand still for a single moment in the midst of this frantic current, letting the sheer weight of this collective exhaustion fully land in our conscious awareness, without trying to immediately fix it or turn it into another self-improvement task. We must feel the incredible gravity of what it means to carry the burden of an identity that believes it is entirely separate, entirely alone, and entirely responsible for conquering its own survival. This chronic tightening is an exhausting way to exist. an unnatural state of hypervigilance that strips our days of their natural color, leaving us with nothing but a gray, analytical survival strategy. We have become master mapmakers, brilliant strategists, and meticulous ledger keepers, yet we have become completely illiterate in the simple primal art of trusting the ground beneath our feet. We know how to defend our storehouses, but we have completely forgotten how to drop our hands to our sides, soften our core, and receive the unconditioned abundance of a single, full cycle of breath. As we slow our pace to investigate this shared condition, we can begin to shift our focus away from the macro environment of the external financial district and turn our attention inward toward the intimate, microscopic landscape of our own physical frame. The body never lies about the price we pay for our survival anxiety. It records every single financial fear, every transaction panic, and every scarcity trigger in the silent geography of our tissues. When we observe ourselves closely during the course of an average day, we can find the exact physical coordinates where our thoughts of future lack colonize our anatomy. We can feel the subtle, chronic contraction that locks our lower belly into a hard, defensive shield, as if we are physically guarding our vital organs from an imminent strike. We can trace the way our breathing is forced upward, restricted entirely to the shallow, rapid spaces beneath our collarbones, signaling a permanent state of metabolic emergency to our brainstem. By mapping these physical holding patterns, we can begin to understand that our relationship with money is not a collection of logical decisions made in a vacuum, but a deeply rooted, somatic survival loop that holds our entire physical being in a state of unyielding lockdown. This somatic freezing is particularly evident when we watch our movements around the simple act of transaction. The moment we are asked to let go of a resource, whether it is paying a bill, investing in a creative project, or simply purchasing a meager, invisible micro-contraction flashes through our nervous system. Our fingers tighten around the card, our shoulders lift a fraction of an inch toward our ears, and a cold, low-level flutter of unease ripples through the pit of our stomach. This is the ancient reptilian brain reacting to a financial transaction exactly as it would react to a loss of blood or a depletion of vital fat stores before a long winter. The mind creates a narrative of economic strategy, but the body is experiencing a primal state of threat, a deep-seated belief that every departure of resource diminishes our core self and brings us closer to extinction. We live our lives with our internal fists permanently clenched, trying to hold on to the water of life by squeezing it as tightly as possible, completely unaware that the very act of frantic clutching is what is causing our spirit to thirst, wither, and starve in the middle of a fertile world. The transition from this collective, atmospheric exhaustion to our individual lives is often embodied by a single recurring figure in the modern landscape: highly successful, financially secure professional who remains completely paralyzed by an imagined future poverty, unable to experience the genuine fruits of their own labor. Let us call this universal archetype the sentinel of the empty granary. On the surface, the sentinel is a master of resource acquisition, a strategic thinker whose career is a decorated monument to calculated foresight, risk mitigation, and unyielding economic productivity. They are the ones who cross every boundary to secure a contract, the ones whose analytical minds can project market trends months in advance, and the ones who have meticulously built an enviable safety net of assets and investments. When you look into their eyes during a professional negotiation, you see a sharp, hyper-vigilant focus that commands absolute authority. They have turned the pursuit of future survival into a highly sophisticated science, and their life is celebrated by society as the very definition of pragmatic intelligence and security. Yet, when the external noise of the marketplace subsides and the long nights descend, the sentinel of the empty granary collapses into a state of profound psychological confinement. The very skills that made them formidable in the external world, the capacity to anticipate worst-case scenarios, the hypervigilance against potential loss, and the relentless drive to protect the perimeter become the exact mechanisms of their internal torture. If we were to perform a meticulous somatic mapping of this individual's physical body during a moment of routine financial assessment, we would discover an anatomical landscape defined by a silent, structural state of siege. It begins deep within the core of the physical frame, precisely in the soft tissue of the abdominal wall and the profound fibers of the psoas muscles. Throughout the day, as bills are reviewed, transactions are executed, or economic forecasts are passed, the lower abdomen is pulled inward and locked into a hard, rigid brace. This is not a simple choice, it is an ancient, involuntary animal survival reflex, a physical guarding of the vulnerable gut against an expected predatory strike. When the body perceives that its life support is under threat, it instantly tightens this central axis to brace for an impact. In our modern landscape, the threat is no longer a physical predator, but a shifting economic metric or an unexpected invoice. Yet the deep brainstem cannot tell the difference, leaving the physical core locked in a permanent, exhausting state of structural armor. Moving up the physical anatomy, this systemic freezing patterns itself into the respiratory mechanics, completely disrupting the natural cadence of our biology. When we observe the breathing pattern of the scarcity-driven individual, we find that the chest wall has become stiff and immovable. The breath is forced upward, restricted entirely to a shallow, rapid clavicular movement that barely registers beneath the throat. The diaphragm, which should naturally drop and soften with every inhalation to create a wave of neurobiological safety, remains locked in a hard protective contraction. This shallow sipping of air acts as a direct metabolic alarm system, constantly flashing signals of impending starvation to the brainstem. Because the body believes it is trapped in an environment of extreme deprivation, it systematically diverts blood away from the digestive organs and into the extremities, preparing the limbs to either fight or flee. This chronic state of emergency constructs a dense cold pressure precisely in the solar plexus, a knot of raw physical anxiety that sits like an unswallowed stone in the center of the chest. It is the body's physical acting out of the terrifying belief that there is never enough, that the world is an inherently hostile desert, and that any lapse in vigilance will lead to immediate extinction. This pathology of continuous preservation manifests most intimately in the microscopic movements of the hands and fingers, introducing the profound metaphorical system of the closed vault of starved grain. Imagine an ancient kingdom blessed with an incredibly rich, golden harvest. The fields have yielded an abundance of grain, enough to feed every family, to plant new crops, and to celebrate the sweetness of life under the sun. However, the ruler of this kingdom, consumed by an intense fear of a future drought, orders every single kernel to be gathered immediately and locked behind the heavy, iron doors of a subterranean vault. No one is permitted to touch the grain, no light is allowed to enter the space, and no fresh air is permitted to circulate through the stone chambers. The ruler stands guard at the door day and night, checking the locks, counting the keys, and obsessively reviewing the ledgers of preservation. Decades pass, and outside the vault, the immediate life of the kingdom begins to wither. The people grow weak, the children forget the taste of bread, and the ruler's own body becomes emaciated and frail from hunger. When the iron doors are finally opened after a lifetime of defense, it is discovered that because the grain was completely cut off from light, air, and circulation, the entire harvest has rotted into a toxic, moldy powder, completely useless to any living soul. We perform this exact same act of systemic self-destruction when we allow our survival anxiety to lock our time, our energy, and our capacity for joy inside a dark, airless psychological vault of future insurance. We convince ourselves that we are only hoarding our resources temporarily, that once we reach a certain numerical milestone, we will finally open the doors, soften our bodies, and allow ourselves to experience the richness of life. But because the mind is locked in a habitual rhythm of intense grasping, the milestone always moves further away the closer we get to it. We treat our immediate life as an empty, disposable corridor to be sprinted through, denying ourselves the simple grace of a shared meal, the warmth of a spontaneous act of generosity, or the peace of an open afternoon, all for the sake of protecting a future that exists only as a phantom thought. We hold our vitality hostage to our fear, standing watch over our accumulated wealth like an impoverished gatekeeper, completely unaware that while our accounts may be overflowing, our actual lived experience is starving to death inside the very vault we built to protect it. The deep tragedy of this existence lies in the fact that the closed vault can never satisfy the insatiable hunger of the scarcity mindset. When our relationship with resources is governed by fear, money ceases to be a functional medium of exchange and transforms into a heavy psychological weight that distorts our entire cognitive processing. We begin to view every single interaction through the distorting lens of a ledger. We evaluate our friendships based on their professional utility, we calculate our leisure time in terms of lost productivity, and we measure the beauty of our world exclusively by its economic cost. We experience a profound erosion of our capacity for spontaneity, as every unexpected change in our schedule or environment is perceived as a direct threat to our carefully managed storehouse. We have become terrifyingly efficient at counting the cost of everything, yet we are profoundly incapable of feeling the value of anything. We live in a self-imposed exile from the living world, a state of psychological starvation that is entirely detached from our actual material reality, running a continuous simulation of lack that poisons our bloodstream and turns the soft tissues of our human anatomy into a rigid, unyielding monument to fear. Let us look closely at how this internal freezing patterns our everyday language and cognitive habits. We notice that we begin to describe our lives using a vocabulary of absolute depletion. We talk about being emotionally bankrupt, about running on empty, or about spending our energy as if our capacity for presence were a finite currency that is constantly being stolen from us. We have completely severed our connection from the natural rhythms of regeneration, forgetting that the earth does not store our harvest in a dark box out of fear of the winter. The soil allows the grain to fall, to dissolve, and to circulate through the dark matrix of the ground, trusting the inherent, interdependent intelligence of the seasons to bring forth new life when the conditions are ripe. We, however, treat our resources as a rigid shield to defend a separate, fragile self against a hostile universe, tightening our fists until our palms bleed, completely oblivious to the reality that the very act of frantic clutching is what keeps us trapped in an artificial winter of our own creation. To step outside this relentless cycle of external achievement and internal erosion, we must be willing to sit quietly and look directly into the underlying mechanics of our own minds. We must examine the profound psychological illusions that give birth to this frantic, unending striving, and we must do so with the precision of a master physician diagnosing a terminal illness. For centuries, humanity has carried a basic, flawed assumption about the nature of existence, a deep-seated belief that we are fixed, permanent entities who must constantly build, defend, and fortify a solid identity in the world. We treat our names, our careers, our titles, and our bank accounts as an architectural fortress, convinced that if we can make the walls high enough and the achievements grand enough, we can shield ourselves from the inherent fragility of being alive. But when we look at the reality of our lives through the lens of absolute honesty, we discover that this fortress is built entirely upon shifting sand, Everything we are trying so desperately to hold on to our youthful energy, our social status, our professional relevance, and the very structure of our daily routines, caught in a state of continuous, unstoppable flux. The projects that consume our nights will eventually become obsolete. The organizations we pour our youth into will evolve or dissolve, and the titles we wear like heavy suits of armor will someday be stripped away by the passage of time. When we refuse to acknowledge this universal truth of constant change, we create an immense, unbearable friction within our physical bodies and psychological landscapes. We experience the natural transience of life, not as a beautiful, flowing river, but as a violent threat to our survival. Every minor shift in our professional environment, every piece of critical feedback, and every unexpected delay feels like a direct assault on our very right to exist. This is the moment where the mind commits its most devastating evolutionary error, a phenomenon that ancient wisdom describes through the timeless teaching of the two arrows. Imagine a traveler walking through a dense, unfamiliar forest who is suddenly struck in the flesh by a sharp stray arrow. The physical impact of that first arrow causes immediate pain, bleeding, and structural damage to the tissues. This first arrow represents the unavoidable challenges of human existence, the physical fatigue of a long day, the natural limitations of our time and energy, the market downturns, and the reality that we cannot control every variable in our environment. It is a universal law that to have a body and a mind means we will occasionally be struck by the first arrow of circumstance, discomfort, or fatigue. However, the traveler in the forest does not simply experience the pain of the first strike. Instead, they sit beneath a tree, look at the wound, and begin to scream in a frenzy of panic and rage. They ask why this happened to them. They curse the unseen archer. They terrify themselves with visions of infection and death. And in their absolute despair, they pick up a second arrow from their own quiver and drive it deliberately into the exact same wound. This second arrow represents our internal reaction to the initial difficulty. It is the brutal, unforgiving monologue that echoes in our heads when we feel tired or overwhelmed. When our body naturally signals that it requires rest, the second arrow is the voice that shames us, calling us lazy, weak, or incompetent. When a project faces a temporary setback, the second arrow is the catastrophic narrative that transforms a simple mistake into a total declaration of our personal worthlessness. The first arrow causes a clean, manageable physical wound. The second arrow introduces a toxic, self-inflicted poison that inflames our entire nervous system and locks us in a state of permanent agony. We must realize that the vast majority of the suffering experienced by the hyperachiever is not caused by the external workload itself, but by the relentless trajectory of this second arrow. We are not breaking down because we have too many tasks to complete. We are breaking down because we are constantly punishing ourselves for being human beings who possess limitations. We have established an internal tyranny where the ego acts as a merciless judge, measuring our daily output against an impossible idealized standard of mechanical perfection. If we accomplish 9 out of 10 items on our checklist, the mind does not rest in the satisfaction of the 9 achievements. It hyper-focuses on the single uncompleted task, using it as a weapon to lacerate our self-esteem before we go to sleep. This is the ultimate pathology of the unexamined life. We have become our own most vicious persecutors, using our intellect, our focus, and our analytical skills not to liberate ourselves, but to construct a more efficient torture chamber for our spirit. This profound psychological error was illuminated thousands of years ago in a historical encounter between a master teacher and a young man named Sona, who was a highly accomplished musician before dedicating himself to a path of deep mental cultivation. Sona was a person of immense drive and determination, and he applied the exact same hyper-aggressive work ethic to his inner practice that he had once used in the external world. He practiced walking meditation until his feet were raw, blistered, and bleeding on the rough ground. He deprived himself of sleep, pushed past his body's screams for rest, and strained his mind to the absolute point of exhaustion, believing that illumination could be conquered through an immense act of raw willpower. Yet, despite his extraordinary effort, his mind remained agitated, tense, and completely devoid of peace. He found himself trapped in a state of profound frustration, weeping in the quiet of the night, ready to abandon his journey entirely because he felt he had failed. The teacher, recognizing the deep structural friction within the young man, sat beside him on the earth and did not offer a complex abstract lecture on philosophy. Instead, he met the young man on the ground of his own lived experience, asking him about the craft he understood best. He asked Sona what happened when he was tuning the strings of his lute during his days as a musician. He asked whether the instrument would produce a beautiful, resonant, and harmonious melody if the strings were stretched and cranked as tightly as possible. Sona replied immediately that if the strings were over-tightened, they would become rigid and brittle, producing only a harsh, piercing shriek before inevitably snapping under the immense pressure. The teacher then asked what would happen if the strings were left loose, sagging, and completely slack. Sona explained that in such a state the strings would be lifeless, incapable of holding a vibration, and would produce nothing but a dull, empty thud. Finally, the teacher asked where the true music was found. Sona looked up, his eyes clearing as the realization dawned upon him, and he whispered that the music was found only when the strings were tuned to the exquisite, delicate middle, neither too tight nor too loose, but perfectly balanced in harmony with the structural design of the wooden instrument. This timeless dialogue cuts through the illusions of the modern productivity trance like a surgical scalpel. It reveals that the path to true excellence, peace, and sustainable output is not found in the continuous tightening of our internal strings, nor is it found in total passive laziness. It is found in the radical cultivation of the middle wire state of dynamic, responsive calibration, where we learn to listen to the natural boundaries of our biology and our mind. When we see that our strings are screaming under the pressure of our expectations, the solution is not to whip ourselves forward with more intensity. The solution is to deliberately, mindfully turn the tuning peg back, releasing the unnecessary tension so that our life can once again produce a resonant, beautiful sound. We must understand that rest is not an act of weakness, nor is it a luxury that we must earn through an exhausting display of performance. Rest is a sacred, structural necessity for the instrument itself. Without it, the material degrades, the elasticity is lost, and we become entirely incapable of offering our true gifts to the world around us. To fully embody this insight, we must dismantle the false construct of the ego that drives our chronic overachievement. We must see that this false self is nothing more than a collection of passing thoughts, societal conditioning, and anxious projections that we have mistakenly identified as our true essence. When we drop the heavy burden of trying to defend this counterfeit king, a profound space opens up within our awareness. We no longer need to treat every hour of the day as a battlefield where our worth must be proven through continuous conquest. We can begin to witness our thoughts, our deadlines, and our ambitions as passing weather formations in the vast, open sky of our consciousness. The clouds may be dark, heavy, and filled with the thunder of urgent demands, but the sky itself remains completely untouched, spacious, and inherently at peace. By anchoring ourselves in this deeper, panoramic awareness, we can begin the practical, architectural work of restructuring our relationship to our bodies, our time, and the work of our hands. To move from the cognitive recognition of our chronic scarcity and economic anxiety into a deeply embodied state of structural balance, We must actively build a new internal architecture. We cannot simply think our way out of a prison that was constructed by our daily physical habits. The closed vault of our nervous system requires a hands-on, meticulous process of manual recalibration, a willingness to intervene directly at the level of the flesh, the breath, and the routine structures of our day. If we leave our transformation in the realm of intellectual theory, the moment an urgent expense arises, a volatile market shift occurs, or a critical financial decision approaches, our ancient conditioning will seize control, our psoas muscles will clamp shut, and the armor across our abdominal wall will freeze solid once again. Therefore, the architecture of our liberation must be practical, systematic, and grounded entirely in the direct, somatic reality of our immediate experience. The first foundational pillar of this recalibration process begins with what we can call the practice of the soft belly. Because the body acts as an absolute mirror for our survival anxiety, we must learn to use the body in reverse to signal absolute safety back to our brainstem. At multiple intervals throughout our waking hours, specifically when we find ourselves reviewing our finances, calculating future projections, or engaging in transactions, we must train ourselves to establish an internal radar that scans the specific muscles of the lower core. When we lock our awareness onto the abdomen, we almost invariably find that we are holding a massive amount of unnecessary force, drawing the belly inward and upward as if trying to shield our vitals from an imminent blow. The direct intervention requires us to deliberately, consciously invite the abdominal wall to expand outward, to soften completely, and to hang loose without any structural constriction. As we perform this simple physical adjustment, allowing the breath to drop deeply into the lowest basin of the torso, a profound neurological shift occurs. The deep muscles of the core and the psoas are intimately connected to the vagus nerve, the primary highway of our parasympathetic nervous system, which commands the body to rest, restore, and decelerate. By deliberately relaxing the belly, we send an unmistakable chemical message down into the depths of our biology, informing our ancient evolutionary survival mechanisms that there is no scarcity in this room, that our survival is not being threatened by this specific moment, and that it is safe to drop our protective armor. We must integrate this practice not as a special meditation session away from our daily responsibilities, but as a silent, invisible companion to our most high-stakes professional actions. We can soften our belly while executing a financial trade. We can expand our breath while looking at an unexpected invoice. We can maintain a relaxed core while negotiating a contract. In doing so, we systematically deactivate the brain's survival alarms, preventing the initial sparks of financial friction from igniting into a chronic systemic wildfire of anxiety. The second structural intervention in our architecture of transformation addresses our distorted relationship with material circulation, an exercise we can define as the practice of the opened palm. The scarcity-driven mind is obsessively focused on grasping, clutching, and holding on to things, a psychological state that physically patterns itself into the microscopic movements of our hands. To break this frantic momentum, we must use our posture to physically reverse the micro-movements of hoarding. Whenever we engage in a financial transaction, whether we are paying for our morning coffee, transferring funds to an employee, or investing in a new enterprise, we must bring our full, mindful awareness to the physical hand that is executing the action. Before we hand over the card, click the transfer button, or sign the agreement, we must take a brief pause to allow our fingers to uncurl, stretching the palms wide open toward the sky and intentionally relaxing the muscles of the wrists and forearms. As we rest in this opened palm alignment, we consciously reframe the transaction through the lens of deep interconnectedness. We train our minds to view the departure of resources not as a depletion of a finite, isolated self, but as a necessary act of reciprocal exchange within a vast living ecological network. We recognize that just as a field cannot grow grain if it holds onto every seed in a dark box, our lives cannot experience true vitality if we block the natural flow of our resources. When we pass our funds over with an open, relaxed hand, we are physically acting out a deep, systemic trust in life's regenerative capacity. We are acknowledging that money is not a rigid shield to be hoarded out of fear, but an energetic current that must circulate through the world to bring value, nourishment, and growth to the entire human community. By changing the physical gesture of our transactions, we slowly dissolve the underlying trauma of lack, teaching our nervous system that we can let go of a resource without triggering our extinction sequence. This somatic retraining must be paired with a radical cognitive reframing that teaches the mind to systematically dissolve the internal ledger of lack. The high achiever's mind behaves like a broken auditing machine, obsessively counting the cost of every action while remaining completely blind to the inherent abundance of the present moment. To interrupt this habitual conditioning, we must cultivate the sacred boundary of contentment, a mental discipline that requires us to pause before every single purchase or financial calculation to clearly distinguish between the body's genuine, structural needs and the ego's insatiable desire to patch over its internal insecurity. When we feel the sudden, compulsive urge to acquire a new possession, to secure a higher milestone, or to lock down another layer of insurance, we do not blindly follow the impulse. Instead, we take a step back, place our hands over our heart, and ask whether this acquisition will truly nourish our life, or whether we are simply trying to buy a temporary escape from the phantom whispering of scarcity. In that small space of inquiry, we strip our financial fears of their power to dictate our behavior. We realize that the ego's hunger for security is a bottomless pit that can never be filled by any amount of money, possessions, or external validation, because the fear itself is not caused by a lack of resources, it is caused by the illusion of a separate, vulnerable self. By anchoring ourselves in this spacious awareness, we can begin to witness our financial responsibilities not as heavy stones carried upon our backs, but as passing weather formations in the vast sky of our consciousness. A difficult quarter, an unexpected expense, or a fluctuating market metric may arise like a dark, heavy storm cloud, but the sky of our baseline awareness remains completely untouched, spacious, and inherently at peace. We can manage the cloud. We can respond to the weather with clear, analytical intelligence, but we strictly refuse to tie our human value or our peace of mind to the shifting patterns of the climate. Finally, this architecture of transformation requires us to integrate our mindfulness practices into the very structures of our daily consumer and professional habits. We must establish the discipline of the intentional pause, a commitment to let a financial alert sit unread, to let an invoice wait, or to let a strategic plan pause while we complete 3 full, uninterrupted cycles of conscious breathing. Before we respond to an economic challenge or execute a high-stress decision, we place our feet flat on the floor, feel the solid, unyielding support of the earth beneath us, and take a deep, slow inhalation through the nose, watching the breath travel all the way down into our soft, open belly. We hold it for a single quiet heartbeat, and then we let the exhalation flow out through relaxed lips, allowing our shoulders to drop a fraction of an inch. We repeat this for 3 full cycles. In the space of those 3 breaths, we return to the seat of our conscious authority, reminding ourselves that our truest wealth is our capacity for presence, awareness, and unconditioned freedom, which no market crash or economic volatility can ever take away from us. We choose to treat our biological frame with compassion, honoring its natural boundaries, its need for rest, and its inherent cycles of energy, rather than driving it forward like a beast of burden with the whip of survival panic. By choosing to tune the strings of our life, With gentleness, patience, and profound somatic intelligence, we ensure that the vessel of our spirit remains whole, resilient, and perfectly prepared to navigate whatever weather the world may bring. The slow, deliberate recalibration of our physical body and the systematic dismantling of our cognitive illusions carry us, step by step, out of the stormy air of continuous striving and into a climate of profound, unshakable sanctuary. As the tight armor across our shoulder blades begins to thaw under the warmth of sustained presence, and as the clenching of our jaw yields to the deep signal of biological safety, a radical transformation occurs within the inner theater of our consciousness. We find ourselves entering a state of being that is completely foreign to the modern productivity trance state. We can recognize as the grace of radical non-striving. This is not a condition of passive laziness, nor is it a state of intellectual detachment where we no longer care about the quality of our actions. Rather, it is a magnificent panoramic stillness that arises when we finally drop the exhausting, lifespan-consuming assumption that we must continuously prove our right to exist on this earth through an endless exhibition of external competence. In this newly uncovered space of awareness, the entire texture of our reality undergoes a profound shift. When we look at a task list or an upcoming professional milestone, we no longer see a battlefield where our survival as a worthy human being is constantly at stake. The frantic, hyper-accelerated momentum that used to drive our days is replaced by an exquisite, cool clarity. We move through our responsibilities with the same unhurried, natural efficiency of a river cutting through a stone canyon knot, because the river is desperately trying to reach the ocean to prove its worth, but simply because flowing is its natural, unobstructed expression. We find that we can write the email, design the strategy, or manage the crisis with an unprecedented level of creative precision, because 90% of our psychological energy is no longer being wasted on the anxious inner monologue of the second arrow. We are no longer performing for an invisible audience or running from a phantom critic. We are simply present, resting entirely in the undeniable completeness of the immediate action. This state of consciousness is characterized by a profound cells-deep physical ease that permeates our entire anatomical frame. Our breathing remains deep, rhythmic, and rooted in the soft expanse of the lower abdomen, keeping our nervous system firmly anchored in a baseline of unshakable safety even when the environment around us becomes chaotic. We notice that our senses have opened up to the world with a brilliant, multi-sensory vividness that we had long forgotten. The taste of a simple glass of water becomes an experience of deep nourishment. The visual mosaic of the city streets appears rich and detailed rather than a blurry obstacle course to be sprinted through, and the sound of the wind moving through the leaves carries a sense of profound, quiet companionship. We have returned to the biological reality of our living tissues, stepping out of the small, suffocating prison of our thoughts and expanding into the boundless, vibrant field of the living world. As we inhabit this sanctuary of non-striving, we begin to realize the absolute truth of the historical teachers' ultimate transmission, the timeless reminder that our essential nature is already inherently complete, luminous, and whole from the very beginning. We do not need to construct a permanent fortress of achievements to protect our identity, because the space of our awareness cannot be threatened by the shifting weather of circumstance. We do not need to tune the strings of our life to a piercing, unsustainable shriek to earn our place in the universe, because our value is not a dynamic metric that fluctuates with our economic output or social validation. We are already an organic part of the vast tapestry of existence, as fully entitled to our breath and our presence as the mountains, the oceans, and the stars. When this realization sinks into our bones, the frantic, compulsive need to constantly become something else entirely dissolves, leaving us with the immense, breathtaking relief of simply being who we already are. We stand now at the edge of this vast open horizon, where the old stories of chronic overachievement and systematic self-violence no longer hold power over our choices. The blue light of the glowing rectangle on the desk may still hum. The city may continue its relentless, neon-lit acceleration, and the deadlines of the modern workspace will inevitably arrive, but they can no longer colonize the sacred interior of our soul. We have learned how to manually turn the tuning peg back with gentleness and wisdom, ensuring that the beautiful, fragile instrument of our nervous system remains balanced, resilient, and true to its design. We have stepped out of the collective trance of continuous optimization, and we have claimed our birthright as conscious, breathing, and inherently worthy human beings. As the echoes of this journey settle into the deep, quiet spaces of your awareness, and as you feel the natural weight of your bones resting firmly upon the supporting earth, let us leave the frantic demands of the future behind for just one more unhurried moment to ponder a single, vital question. When you finally allow your hands to drop completely to your sides, when you permit your tight jaw to soften into absolute safety, and when you completely discard the heavy, exhausting illusion that you must conquer tomorrow to be worthy of today, who is the silent, spacious, and beautiful presence that remains standing here in the absolute perfection of this single breath.